In the machine shop, a rotating lathe appeared to be operating normally until loose material entered the spindle's rotation path. On the bridge maintenance lane, the parked work truck became part of a chain reaction when an approaching transport vehicle entered its path. Inside the roadside shop, a routine evening suddenly changed when a vehicle left the roadway and entered the storefront without warning. Inside the scrap processing facility, the open furnace appeared stable until the access boundary aligned with the extreme heat exposure area. On the busy city street, a small roadside work area appeared protected until a vehicle crossed the boundary and entered the active work path. Roadside task areas require physical separation from traffic using barriers, buffer space, cones, signs, and equipment positioning. The work boundary must guide vehicles away before the travel path reaches the task area. Inside the woodwork area, the suspended load appeared stable until the lifting path suddenly changed and the load dropped without warning. Maintain exclusion zones around suspended loads, use properly rated rigging and balanced lifting configurations, and keep all access routes outside potential swing, travel, and fall paths throughout the lift. At the power press workstation, access entered the machine's closing path just as the cycle activated. Press access requires zero energy isolation, guarding, interlocks, two-hand controls where required, and lockout whenever entry into the operating area is needed. The ram and closing path must be verified inactive before adjustment or clearing begins. Inside the automated robotic production cell, open access entered the robot's operating envelope during programmed movement. Robotic systems require safe maintenance mode, energy isolation, lockout controls, active interlocks, and secured barriers before cell access begins. Programmed motion paths must remain separated from maintenance and adjustment zones. On the active roadway work zone, traffic control was underway when an approaching vehicle left its lane and entered the protected corridor. Traffic control operations require advance warning, taper zones, channelizing devices, shadow vehicles where needed, and positive control before activity begins near live lanes. The setup must slow, redirect, and separate traffic before it reaches the work corridor. At the construction site, routine work continued around the excavator until access entered the bucket's operating envelope just as the attachment changed position. Raised buckets, booms, and attachments require exclusion zones and controlled access routes. Hydraulic components must be lowered, blocked, isolated, or kept fully separated from access paths whenever stored movement remains possible. On the sidewalk delivery area, a large cabinet shifted off balance as loading operations continued beside the truck. Large cabinet handling requires load stability, mechanical assistance, controlled support, and a clear movement path before unloading begins. The center of gravity must stay inside the support base until the load is fully landed and secured. Inside the narrow masonry shaft, the ladder remained positioned beneath ongoing work above when loose material suddenly broke free from the wall. Establish overhead protection, secure loose materials before work begins, and maintain restricted drop zones whenever activities are taking place at multiple elevations within the same area. On the chemical cargo vessel, routine work near the tank system changed when stored pressure or vapor energy released across the deck. Tank, piping, and cargo space atmospheres require monitoring, isolation, ventilation, and ignition source control before maintenance or cargo operations begin. Flammable vapors and reactive materials must stay outside uncontrolled release conditions. During the city collection route, a sanitation truck developed a mechanical issue as access moved into an active vehicle path. Troubleshooting requires a complete stop, parking controls engaged, movement isolation, and access routes separated from wheel paths, and moving equipment. Vehicle movement must be controlled before any route beside the truck is used. At the utility pole crowded with overhead lines, a routine cable task suddenly became an uncontrolled suspended position event in seconds. Safety principle: use secured positioning systems, approved fall protection equipment, and stable access methods before work begins around overhead infrastructure, and maintain controlled attachment points throughout the task. At the vehicle inspection pit, A routine maneuver entered a blind zone area as the pickup rolled toward the guide path. Vehicle guide routes must remain outside wheel paths, pit edges, and blind zones. Use stop points, mirrors, signals, chocks, and protected side routes so guidance does not depend on visibility alone. Inside a deep excavation, routine digging near a boundary wall suddenly removed critical ground support, turning the trench edge into a collapse path. Excavation work must account for nearby structures before digging begins. Walls, foundations, and surface loads can become unstable when supporting soil is removed without shoring, benching, or engineered protection. On the drilling platform, the suspended component suddenly reversed direction and swung back toward the access stairs without warning. Establish exclusion zones around suspended loads, tension lines, and moving equipment, and keep access routes outside potential swing, recoil, and return paths throughout the operation. At the nighttime loading dock, a forklift carrying a large pallet approached the open delivery truck as activity entered the same travel corridor. Forklift routes require barriers, designated walkways, controlled crossings, and exclusion zones. Activity must remain outside travel paths, turning envelopes, and load movement areas during truck loading. At the tanker transfer area, pressurized gas released from the connection point and formed a spreading vapor cloud across the work area. Pressurized transfer requires inspected hoses, secured connections, isolation controls, shutdown readiness, and a cleared release boundary before flow begins. If containment is lost, stop the transfer, isolate the system, and control the area around the release point. Pressurized gas expands rapidly when released from a confined system, converting stored pressure into high-velocity flow. As gas escapes, it spreads outward from the release point and can change visibility, atmosphere, and safe access conditions. Every pressurized transfer contains stored energy. Control the system before the release path controls the area. At the nighttime yard, the heavily loaded truck stood stationary while shifting load distribution suddenly pushed the vehicle toward its stability limit. Confirm load balance, axle loading, cargo restraint, and ground support conditions before loading, unloading, or inspection activities, and maintain exclusion zones around potential rollover and load shift paths. Between the industrial storage tanks, the inspection route crossed an unprotected opening when a routine check suddenly became a direct path toward gravity. Install fixed guardrails, secured covers, and controlled access barriers around tank openings, pits, and elevated inspection areas, and separate inspection routes from open process spaces using physical protection. An unprotected opening creates a direct vertical travel path with no intermediate barrier to stop movement once support is lost. Guardrails, covers, and access barriers remove the exposure by creating a physical separation between the walking surface and the opening. Openings require protection, not awareness alone. Install physical safeguards before access begins. Inside the electrical control room, energized panels remained exposed as troubleshooting activity unfolded just inches from live electrical components. De-energize, isolate, lock out, and establish an electrically safe work condition before opening panels or accessing electrical equipment, and maintain controlled boundaries around exposed energized components whenever power remains present. At the construction site, the mobile crane lifted the heavy precast concrete section when stability suddenly failed and the machine overturned under the suspended load. Set mobile cranes on stable ground with fully supported outriggers and keep every lift within rated load, boom, and radius limits before hoisting begins. As the load moves farther from the crane's center, overturning force increases. If load weight, lift radius, or outrigger support exceeds the stability limit, the crane can pivot and overturn. Crane stability can fail before any component breaks. Control the ground, radius, and load before every lift. At the roadside work area, the raised dump truck bed remained elevated beside the vehicle when activity entered the rear movement path. Raised truck beds, tailgates, and moving body components require exclusion zones and approved mechanical props or restraints before inspection, maintenance, or access begins near elevated equipment. Inside the fabrication shop, a suspended steel coil hung above the flatbed trailer when a lifting connection gave way. Suspended steel coils require a rigid exclusion area around the lift. Load paths, drop paths, swing paths, and rigging failure zones must remain closed until the coil is fully landed, blocked, and secured. A suspended load stores potential energy while the rigging carries the weight. If a sling, hook, connection point, or lifting component fails, gravity accelerates the load downward and can add swing or momentum. Every suspended load is a stored energy hazard. Verify rigging and keep the load path closed until the lift is complete. Inside a textile factory, a spinning production machine creates rapid inward movement as rotating rollers continue operating at high speed. Do maintain safe clearance from exposed rotating equipment and keep loose materials away from moving rollers at all times. Rotating industrial rollers create continuous pinch zones where nearby material follows the direction of rotation once contact occurs. As objects move closer to the spinning section, friction between the rotating surface and nearby material increases instantly, allowing rotational momentum to transfer motion rapidly through the system. High-speed rollers provide very limited reaction time because the rotating system continuously feeds movement along its operating path until power is fully stopped. Rotating machinery turns small clearance mistakes into immediate hazards. Maintain distance and control the zone before movement begins. Inside the metal processing workshop, a routine task near heated equipment became an electrical release event as energy found an unintended path. Electrical energy must be isolated before work near conductive equipment, exposed wiring, or energized systems. Metal tools, moisture, grounded surfaces, and heat-affected equipment require controlled separation throughout the task. Inside the wet processing room, a routine adjustment near electrical equipment suddenly became an energized event as moisture and electricity converged. Keep electrical systems separated from wet process areas, maintain equipment in good condition, and isolate power sources before adjustments, cleaning, or maintenance begin around conductive surfaces and standing water. Water reduces electrical resistance and provides additional conductive paths for current flow. When moisture combines with damaged insulation, exposed conductors, or equipment faults, electrical energy can travel along unintended paths and be released unexpectedly. Moisture can extend electrical paths far beyond the equipment itself. Keep the area dry and isolate power before contact. In the crowded cargo loading area between two trucks, a large unsecured panel appeared stable until its support path shifted. Sheet materials require positive restraints, stable support points, controlled storage methods, and cleared exclusion zones before movement. Leaning, staged, or partially supported panels must be secured before access continues nearby. While repairing the metal roof at the residential property, a routine task entered an unexpected opening beneath the work surface. Roof work requires fall protection, secured access systems, and identification of all openings, weak surfaces, and unsupported sections before work begins. Every opening should be protected with covers, barriers, or engineered controls. Roof panels and coverings can conceal unsupported spans, deteriorated materials, or openings that are not visible from the walking surface. When the applied load exceeds the support capacity, gravity redirects movement through the opening. A roof surface cannot be judged by appearance alone. Inside the tire service workshop, a large tire shifted unexpectedly during lifting and turned into an uncontrolled movement path. Large tires require mechanical assistance, controlled handling methods, stable positioning, and clear rollover, rebound, and rotation paths before lifting or repositioning begins. At the warehouse loading dock, a forklift movement placed the moving load and the access route on the same path. Forklift routes and access routes require physical separation, controlled crossings, and clear exclusion zones around moving loads. Access to the load path should remain closed until communication is confirmed and the route is clear. A loaded forklift has reduced visibility and requires distance to slow, stop, or change direction. As the load moves, its mass and momentum continue through the travel corridor. Moving loads require a protected travel corridor. Maintain separation and keep the load path clear at all times. Inside the automotive workshop, an elevated vehicle released a heavy component from beneath the chassis. Removable vehicle components require approved stands, restraints, secondary supports, and controlled release methods before work begins beneath elevated equipment. From the elevated utility bucket, the live line maintenance tool approached the overhead conductor when an electrical arc formed across the connection point. Live line work requires verified approach distances, properly rated insulated equipment, confirmed voltage, and controlled work boundaries before any task begins near energized conductors. Electricity can bridge an air gap when voltage exceeds the insulating strength of the surrounding air. Once an arc forms, energy releases as light, heat, pressure, and expanding gases along the arc path. Air alone is not always an effective electrical barrier. Maintain clearance and control every potential arc path before approaching energized systems. Along the building walkway, a mobile scaffold was being repositioned when the structure began to lean and collapse. Mobile scaffolds require cleared platforms, locked wheels when in use, stable level surfaces, and obstruction-free routes before relocation. Scaffold systems should be moved only after the structure is balanced, lowered where needed, and controlled. At the exterior electrical service panel, troubleshooting from a ladder continued near the open enclosure when an electrical arc flashed from the panel. Electrical panels require an electrically safe work condition before access begins. Exposed conductors need controlled boundaries, insulated tools, rated protective equipment, isolation, and testing before troubleshooting continues. An electrical arc can occur when current bridges a gap through a conductive object, tool, or ionized air path. The energy release happens extremely quickly and can produce light, heat, pressure, and metal vapor. Electrical energy can remain present even when equipment appears inactive. Isolate, test, and control the boundary before access begins. At the residential delivery entrance, the refrigerator was guided across the doorstep when a sudden load shift turned the appliance into an uncontrolled moving load. Large appliance movement requires a planned route, stable transition points, moving equipment, and controlled support before thresholds, steps, ramps, or elevation changes are crossed. Refrigerators are tall, heavy loads with a center of gravity that can shift rapidly during movement. When the base meets an obstacle or support changes, the center of gravity can move beyond the support area and create a tipping force. Transitions are often the most unstable part of a move. Control the load and prepare the route before every change in elevation. Inside the workshop mezzanine area, the large panel appeared ready to separate cleanly until stored force within the material suddenly released. Use controlled cutting, scoring, or separation methods for large sheet materials. Establish clear movement boundaries and keep access routes outside potential rebound, flex, and release paths during material handling. Inside the multi-level indoor pool complex, an upper-level walkway became unstable as the route shifted toward the open edge above the water. Elevated pool areas require protected walkways, slip control measures, guardrails, barriers, and edge protection wherever level changes or open edges are present. Wet surfaces reduce friction between the walking surface and the access route. Once support is lost near an elevated edge, gravity accelerates movement toward the lower level. Elevated pool areas combine slip exposure with open edge exposure. Use protected access routes and maintain edge separation. In the residential driveway, the large panel appeared under control atop the service van until a sudden gust transformed it into a wind-driven sail. Assess wind conditions before handling large sheets, panels, or boards. Maintain multiple control points during lifting and positioning, and secure materials immediately whenever wind can influence load movement. At the busy scrapyard, a metal section moved from the truck bed as weight and momentum pulled the load along its travel path. Scrap unloading requires stable support, controlled handling equipment, and clear separation from the load path. Heavy material must not depend on balance or force once momentum begins to carry it outward. As the metal section accelerates outward, momentum continues carrying the load in the direction of movement. When stability depends on the load itself, the center of gravity can move beyond the support area and transfer motion through the material. Heavy scrap can keep moving after it leaves its original position. Control the load path and keep the access route separated. Inside the construction area, ladder access continued below elevated material when a loose board entered the work path. Overhead, materials require secure storage, controlled positioning, and exclusion zones below elevated work. Access routes must remain separated from drop paths until the material above is restrained. Once the board loses support, gravity accelerates it along the fall path. As drop distance increases, velocity and impact energy increase, while the protected area below becomes more important. Overhead, work creates exposure both above and below the task area. Secure materials at the source and keep the drop path clear. Beside the refuse container, a hammer strike redirected after impact and entered an unintended movement path. Impact work requires stabilized material, clear strike and rebound zones, and access routes outside the deflection path. Hammers, punches, wedges, and striking tools need controlled alignment before force is applied. Inside the warehouse aisle, the forklift approached the doorway with the mast raised when the available overhead clearance suddenly disappeared. Travel with the mast in the designated lowered position, assess overhead clearances before movement begins, and maintain a route free of overhead obstructions, door frames, beams, and structural components. A raised mast extends the forklift's operating height and shifts the machine's highest point into the path of overhead structures. When the mast contacts a fixed object, the resulting force can be transferred through both the forklift and the structure, creating sudden changes in motion and stability. Safe travel requires attention to overhead space as well as floor conditions. Lower the mast, confirm clearance, and verify the route before moving. At the bridge construction site, the suspended concrete panel shifted from its intended position and entered a swing path beside the mobile crane. Suspended loads require exclusion zones before lifting begins. Swing, rotation, and drop paths must remain closed until the load is fully controlled, landed, and secured. Suspended concrete panels store gravitational potential energy while supported by the crane and rigging system. If alignment changes or load stability is lost, gravity and momentum can redirect the panel into a swinging or rotating movement path. A suspended load can change direction once stability is lost. Along the narrow industrial access road, the crawler crane suddenly began lifting one side of its tracks as the machine moved beyond its stability margin. Assess ground support, load weight, lift radius, boom configuration, and crane capacity as a complete lifting system before operations begin, and maintain all lifts within the crane's rated stability limits throughout the movement. On the marine work platform beside the tension lifting line, a routine disconnection task entered a stored energy release path. Tension rigging, slings, shackles, pull lines, and load-bearing connections require exclusion zones while under load. Access routes must remain outside recoil, snapback, and release paths until stored energy is isolated. Tension rigging stores potential energy as force moves through lines, fittings, and connection points. If a component fails, disconnects, or slips free, that stored energy releases through the system's natural movement path. Stored energy can remain hidden until a connection changes. Isolate tension systems before the release path opens. Inside the storage room, lined with heavily loaded shelving, rack access turned the entire structure into a collapse path. Elevated storage tasks require approved ladders, platforms, or access equipment. Shelving systems must be anchored, load rated, and kept separate from access routes instead of being used as climbing structures. At the truck repair area, the tire being inflated released stored pressure and turned the surrounding space into a pressure release path. Tire inflation requires calibrated gauges, approved inflation equipment, restraining devices, and protected side positioning. Access routes must remain outside the potential release path of the tire and wheel assembly. Compressed air stores energy inside the tire and wheel assembly as pressure increases. If a tire, wheel, rim, or retaining component fails, that stored energy can release through the assembly's natural release path. Pressurized tire assemblies remain stored energy systems throughout inflation. Control the pressure, maintain distance, and keep the release path clear. Along the construction excavation, the concrete mixer positioned near the trench edge when the supporting ground suddenly gave way. Maintain engineered setback distances for concrete trucks, cranes, and other heavy equipment near excavations, and assess soil conditions, surcharge loading, and ground support capacity before positioning vehicles adjacent to trench edges. In the wooded clearing, the ladder remained positioned against the tree, while the partially cut limb stored energy above the work area. Limb removal requires planned cut sequence, drop zone control, and access. Roots outside swing, rebound, and fall paths. Partially severed branches must be supported or lowered before stored tension is released. Tree limbs can store significant bending and tension forces as they support their own weight and react to cutting forces. As the remaining fibers weaken, gravity and internal stress redistribute through the branch, allowing sudden movement along unpredictable travel paths. Partially cut limbs can remain loaded even when movement is not visible. Control the cut sequence and keep the movement path clear. At a service counter, a large floor fan developed an unexpected electrical path through the equipment housing. Electrical appliances require intact guards, wiring, insulation, and grounding before use. Damaged insulation, internal faults, or missing grounding protection can energize metal components that appear inactive. At the busy roadside work area, a small flame near utility infrastructure became a ground-level pressure release event across the intersection. Suspected gas leaks, damaged utilities, unexplained flames, or vapor releases require a wide exclusion zone and ignition source control until qualified utility response confirms the area is secure. Flammable gases can migrate through underground pathways, utility conduits, trenches, and confined spaces before accumulating nearby. When ignition reaches a combustible gas-air mixture, combustion can expand rapidly and generate pressure movement through the surrounding environment. Gas releases can extend far beyond the visible source. Isolate the area, remove ignition sources, and wait for utility specialists to secure the scene. Don't forget to share what you learned today in the comments. Your insight could save a life. Take care.